Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the international affairs, foreign policy, and global development community, and world news aficionados of all stripes. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. As I am recording this, Israeli forces are bombarding Gaza with artillery fire. This latest escalation in fighting comes after another night of rocket attacks fired from Gaza into Israel. The situation is deteriorating in ways, sadly, that we have seen before. But what distinguishes this latest iteration of the Arab-Israeli conflict is that violence is spreading within Israel. Over the last several days, there have been multiple incidents of mob attacks between Jews and Arabs in towns in Israel with mixed populations between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jews. The threat of widespread communal violence is now very acute. On the line with me to help me understand the events leading up to this latest conflict is Doha el-Kurd. She is an assistant professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and is a researcher at the Arab Institute for Research and Policy Studies. We kick off discussing how an attempt to evict Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem sparked uniquely widespread protests by Palestinian citizens of Israel. She then explains how and why this crisis escalated so quickly and where it may be headed next. In this conversation, we make reference to a piece she wrote in the Washington Post, and I will be sure to include the link in the show notes of this episode. And you can always head over to globaldispatchespodcast.com to access the show notes as well. Needless to say, the situation in Palestine and Israel is rapidly evolving. But this conversation, I do think, will give you the context you need to understand these events as they unfold in the coming days and weeks. As always, please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have suggestions for me of people I should interview or topics I should cover. You are a fantastic audience of global affairs professionals and doers and thinkers, and I always appreciate your suggestions. Hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg, or you can send me an email using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. Now here is my conversation with Doha el-Kurd.
Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in the eastern part of Jerusalem. It was invaded in 1967, so it's now under Israeli occupation. The western part of the city was taken in 1948, and in 1967, these neighborhoods were also subsumed under Israeli occupation. And Sheikh Jarrah is kind of a very strategic neighborhood in terms of its location. Sheikh Jarrah particularly, and Silwan, and Wadi Joz, so these kind of different neighborhoods that ring the old city, they have had severe settlement activity, unlike in other places where it's like they kind of bulldoze land or seize land and then build on top of it. In these places, they're going house by house. The idea is that they can establish basically geographic control and cut off Jerusalem entirely from its Arab population. And they've done this, in a couple of different ways, by either like pushing Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem out of the, Jerusalem proper, quote unquote, by using the separation wall, or by doing things like this, going house to house and trying to push Palestinians out. Essentially, the issue is that there are 8 families who a settler organization called Nahalet Shimon targeted. This organization is based in the U.S. It targeted their homes for like a land dispute and a home ownership dispute case in the Israeli court system. And essentially, they're alleging that these homes belonged to Jewish families before 1948. But most of these families not only either have deeds preceding the state, or they bought the land and built the homes themselves following their original 1948 expulsion. So, like, for example, the el-Kurd family, No relation, by the way, just a
Okay.
a distant, a great grandparent.
I was going to ask that because, this young man, was his name Mohammed el-Kurd, has been sort of a spokesperson for this cause. So good. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, Mohammed el-Kurd and Mona el-Kurd, his younger sister, have been. I mean, I guess we'll get to it later in the podcast, but they've been amazing on social media. But so essentially, like their branch of the family was in Haifa, and so just as an example of the 8 families, so their grandparents were expelled in 1948. They found themselves in East Jerusalem, and with coordination, through coordination with UNRWA, the UNRWA refugee organization, and the Jordanian authorities at the time, what they did was they gave up their refugee status to be able to purchase land and to build their homes and just try to resettle, and hope that they don't get displaced again.
As you mentioned earlier, it has been like a long-standing practice of the Israeli government, at least this current iteration, this kind of right-wing Israeli government, to seek to expropriate Palestinian land around Jerusalem. Why has this incident, the Sheikh Jarrah and the potential expropriation of these 8 families, been such a spark bigger than we have seen in times past, it seems?
Yeah. Sheikh Jarrah, honestly, it's been ongoing. I mean, the first time Mohammed el-Kurd, because you mentioned him, he came on to kind of global attention was in 2009 when he wrote a letter to Obama. So the first time that half of his home was seized. So it's been ongoing. However, why this happened now, why this has been such a spark now, is because one, these kids are grown. They're using social media very effectively. Mohammed el-Kurd, before he was on Twitter, him and his sister were on Instagram. They're highly effective. They know how to get the word out. Other people also, not just them, but other activists have been using social media like Instagram and Instagram stories and TikTok and things like this to bring attention to this. But also there was kind of a perfect storm of antagonization, I think, at this moment in time. First, there was the Israeli authorities, like the Israeli Security and Border Police that polices East Jerusalem, inexplicably banned Palestinians from gathering in public spaces during Ramadan. So that caused ongoing tension. Aside from Sheikh Jarrah, every night almost in the old city, we would see videos of Palestinians being arrested for simply sitting, or food carts being overturned and things like this. So that really agitated people. It became kind of a meeting point for people who wanted to challenge the occupation and show defiance. So even, we had Palestinian citizens from within the Green Line, Palestinian citizens of Israel, were coming to sit in front of Damascus Gate, in front of the old city, to kind of challenge and say no, we're allowed to sit in these public spaces. So they're antagonizing on that end. The Sheikh Jarrah protesters, the families, are calling on people to protest with them and sit in with them. There's an upcoming court date, and they're using social media quite effectively. So they're agitating and antagonizing Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and people who are following that closely. And then there's also the right-wing provocations. I mean, the whole government is right-wing, but particularly these organizations like Lehava and these kind of extremists that marched through the city and shouted death to Arabs and tried to beat people up. So all of this is happening in a very short time span, one after the other. With the Sheikh Jarrah protesters, and very validly are saying, on social media and in their calls for people to come and join them, we are a symptom of what will happen to you. If Sheikh Jarrah falls, Silwan and Wadi al-Jawz and all of these places will also fall. And the fact that the Israeli authorities were upsetting people in all of these different ways at the same time, lent legitimacy to this argument, which is, of course, I mean, I do believe it's a valid argument, but it really sparked urgency in people, because it's on all of these fronts we're being attacked.
For all the reasons you just described, Sheikh Jarrah seems to be this kind of perfect storm of antagonizations, but things seem to have escalated just so quickly. I mean, we are recording this on Thursday. By the time this is published, there may be a Israeli ground incursion in Gaza. For all we know, that's sort of the latest news, is that is very much a real possibility. How did this escalate just so quickly in such a short period of time.
Yeah, so the final kind of like domino to fall was the planned Jerusalem Day marches. Jerusalem Day is on May 11th, and this celebrates Israel's conquest of the eastern part of the city in 1967, where marchers, like quite extremists, oftentimes will march through Arab parts of the city. Palestinians have to close their doors or like not open their businesses. There's often skirmishes and like attacks and things like this. So in this, the backdrop of this entire Ramadan has been this, antagonizing, incidents. And then Jerusalem Day is planned. Activists on the ground have kind of gotten a little bit of momentum. People are joining. It's not just a few people. It's like a lot of people are coming in and like joining these protest and sit-ins. And so the Palestinians vowed that this Jerusalem Day march was not going to happen because it culminates in the marchers going to the Al-Aqsa compound, which is a sacred place, and like, marching through it essentially. So they refused. And so they wanted to like basically do a sit-in at the Aqsa compound and like barricaded the doors. And we saw basically like a day-long battle. Maybe battle's not the right word because it was, one side was armed and one side was not. But a day-long struggle where from the beginning, like from Fajr prayer, like 5 a.m, I remember because I had pulled an all-nighter.
You had this like perfect storm where you had Palestinians staging a sit-in and sort of trying to prevent these Jewish extremists from marching through the streets in the same kind of contested area that contains the Western Wall and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then you had these like wild scenes of like flashbang grenades and tear gas tearing through the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then later in the evening, you had these wild scenes of these like kind of Jewish nationalists kind of dancing and praying at the Western Wall with kind of smoke from the mosque in the background. It was like breathtaking in a terrible way. And then you have rockets being fired by Hamas into Israel and Israeli rockets being fired back into Gaza. Like how did that domino fall?
So it actually happened the same day. So the Palestinians got the march to be rerouted so that they would not pass through the Damascus Gate, and they would go from a different entry point to the Western Wall so that they don't go through and like get into skirmishes with people, essentially. So they succeeded. They succeeded in their sit-in. They succeeded in getting the march rerouted. Then I'm not an expert necessarily on Hamas and its internal decision making, but the argument goes that there was still a threat that the Israeli authorities would go back and re-attack the people sitting in the Aqsa. And Hamas basically made an ultimatum, like I think it was like by 6 p.m, like they would launch a rocket attack, and they did. I personally I didn't quite understand that decision making process, but the rockets.
That's funny. I was going to ask you about that. That the strategic logic of Hamas there. I mean, at least to me, it doesn't make sense. But from like perhaps the point of view of Hamas, if you're seeking to provoke an Israeli response and you see political gain in provoking that Israeli response, then you would want to do something like this.
I mean, there's the people who say, there's one element of Palestinian society, one element of Palestinian public opinion that says like Hamas parachuted itself to try to gain legitimacy in this moment or like make themselves relevant. Another, not insignificant part of, I mean, we don't have any polling, but just from anecdotal evidence, I'm sure there will be polling in June that's set to happen. So I'm sure we'll have a question on this. But for now, anecdotally, I could see that there's another segment of Palestinian public opinion that says, well, no, they needed to raise the cost. They needed to raise the cost of what Israel was doing so that Israel thinks twice about this kind of repression. I mean, I'm not going to adjudicate that necessarily, but I'm not a strategic thinker.
And one thing, I learned from reading your piece in the Washington Post is that to a large degree, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority were irrelevant to the protests at Sheikh Jarrah. It was like organic and had nothing really to do with the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or kind of established, Palestinian political systems.
Oh yeah, the political part. So like the Palestinian Authority, which is dominated by Fatah, was really quite irrelevant. In fact, like we had these funny videos coming out of the Aqsa compound, like before and after the day-long struggle on Jerusalem Day, where people are like, cursing the Palestinian president and saying like, nice of you to like wake up and nice of you to like, say something. I mean, completely irrelevant, really. The Sheikh Jarrah families weren't asking, also just to note, the Palestinian Authority is not allowed to function in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. But even, the political parties like Fatah and Hamas, like they're not responsible at all for the organization of those sit-ins, how they escalated, why the protests became, kind of a groundswelling of support, how the Palestinian citizens of Israel joined. They did not, they had nothing to do with calling for these things. They had nothing to do with organizing these things. Like I said, completely irrelevant. The families in Sheikh Jarrah were not calling on either political party. Now, not to say that there weren't people at the Al-Aqsa compound that day where they fought off the Israeli occupation forces. It's not that, like, I'm not saying that maybe some of them didn't support Hamas. I'm sure there are Fatah supporters and Hamas supporters present, but it's not their doing. This was quite an organic, moment of anger.
That helps. Like, I think people understand why one might say that Hamas was trying to parachute themselves into this situation, insert themselves into something in which previously they, were irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, that's one explanation. Some people have said, some people on the ground have said, some people, it doesn't, if Hamas is going to insert itself in this moment, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, like that complicates their involvement. Because they're citizens of Israel. Like, what does it mean that they're joining protests where, you know what I mean? So, on that level, it complicates things. But then others say like, no, like some people called for them to get involved and wanted them to raise the stakes, so I can't really, I would have to wait until like public opinion comes out. Even public opinion is really quite problematic because it's like just a point in time, people's like anger showing in a public poll, not necessarily like the reason that things happened. So I can't really say why Hamas did what they did, but that's why the rockets were launched, and then Israel, within a few hours, had retaliated with airstrikes, killing in the first night, I think 12 people, 3 children, and then now I don't even know the death toll.
To a large extent, it seems that like we've seen this movie before. Where you have, Netanyahu, who is politically on the ropes to an extent he hadn't been in a long time, kind of perhaps seized this moment of kind of right-wing anger over something happening, in Jerusalem or in the occupied territories or West Bank, somehow seized upon it. Fomented this crisis. You've had violent response by Hamas, violent response by by the IDF and the Israeli army. Like, we've seen this a few times. What, to me at least, distinguishes this moment are levels of communal violence that we're now seeing in areas throughout Israel in which there are large mixed populations between Arabs and Jews. How do you explain sort of that current iteration of what's happening now, which seems really almost like dystopian and terrible in a way that we haven't seen before?
Yeah, so I think before we get to the levels of violence we've seen in the last couple of days within the Green Line, like within, 1948 Israel, one thing was unprecedented before this moment, which is the level of support and participation from Palestinian citizens of Israel in the West Bank, in the East Jerusalem protests. So they were coming to Damascus Gate, they were coming to Sheikh Jarrah, they were, there was this amazing moment where busloads of Palestinian citizens of Israel were trying to come to Al-Aqsa to pray in solidarity and were stopped by the police for no reason given. So they started to walk on the highway. And then the Jerusalemites drove their cars, blocked the other side of the highway so that they could pick them up.
And just to emphasize, in general, we have not seen this level of participation in these kinds of political moments of activism by Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian citizens of Israel before, is what you're saying.
I mean, like, obviously, like during the second intifada, like we have moments where there's solidarity protests. They pay heavily, there are people who die in those solidarity protests, but to this degree, it was we haven't seen it in decades, let's just say. So that was what was happening. Then the Hamas rockets, then the Jerusalem Day struggle, the Hamas rockets, the airstrikes on Gaza that are very indiscriminate, that really angers people. Palestinian citizens of Israel start to protest in their own cities. Like cities we have not seen show protests, again, in decades, are now protesting. They're raising Palestinian flags. In some cases, like, there's like burned cop cars and things like this. So I think the response really alarmed not only the Israeli state, but like Israeli, citizens who either have this sense that there's coexistence, the liberal, element of society that thinks, oh, everything's fine here. It's just the occupation that's the problem. And then it also alarmed the people who thought these people were thoroughly dominated, when clearly they were not. When clearly there's still some element of solidarity with, not just some element. They clearly, sorry for stuttering, but they clearly see that their circumstances of repression and discrimination within Israel are intimately tied to Israel's character and Israel's continued occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So that was quite alarming, I think, to the Israeli public, of all of its elements. And then we saw the mobs that we saw in the last day or two. Time kind of blends together now.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very fast-moving situation, but as we're speaking now, there seems to be this kind of cycle of mob violence that is taking hold in areas, as you said, of Israel, where just like we hadn't previously seen this kind of thing happen before. And to the point where, I think an Israeli official even, threatened that this could, descend into a civil war of sorts befalling Israel.
Yeah, I just wouldn't. I would push back on the term civil war, because there was definitely, like Palestinian protests, and some of them kind of had like a riot element. Like, these terms can be kind of overlapping in some places. So like not every city had, property destruction, but some did. And then there were some instances of like I can't remember which city, but there was a synagogue that was torched. So there were definitely elements of violence when the Palestinians protested. But the difference is that it's not a civil war, because Palestinians don't have any defense. They don't have any military weaponry. They don't have a military representing them. What we saw when the Israeli marchers, when the Israeli riots happened in response, like the next day, in Haifa, in Tyre, in south of Tel Aviv, Bet Yam, all of these places, like the cops, the Israeli police, the Israeli authorities were either not intervening or participating.
I guess there's a lot of uncertainty, obviously, in terms of how this crisis will play out over the coming, days and weeks. But are there any like inflection points that you'll be looking towards that will suggest to you how this conflict, this crisis, will proceed?
That's a tough one. Honestly, I'm at the risk of sounding unprofessional, like, I study this, but I also have family there. And this has been like, I'm just trying to keep up, with some of the things that have been happening. But in terms of like, what I'm concerned about, or like what I'm going to be looking for, is now Netanyahu has announced, or the Israeli government has announced, that there will be administrative detention used against Palestinians who protest inside Israel. This is a tactic that's used in the West Bank and the occupied territories generally, where you can be detained indefinitely without charge, and people get put, and like it keeps people off the streets and like in prisons and things like this. And this hasn't been used against Palestinian citizens of Israel since the lifting of the military rule on their cities, but now it's going to be used. That strikes me as like, if they go through with that, if they redeploy the Israeli Defense Forces to Palestinian towns within the Green Line, it strikes me like that would indicate that there's going to be much greater repression. So like the Israeli authority is, the Israeli government is not, trying to cool things down necessarily. We might see more violence. Now, on that front. On the Jerusalem front, I do worry about the settlers in those neighborhoods, which often they use violence against the families. And if the court date was like delayed like by a month or something, as we near the court date again, what could happen in that space might have ramifications for the rest of the unrest. And then in Gaza, if they do decide to go through with a ground invasion, we're gonna see like harsher violence, like we saw when they attacked on the ground in I think 2014 of the Shaja'iyya and stuff like this, and it's going to become much more in kind of an intractable affair. I don't know if that's the right
possibly
word.
More internationalized at that point, which is what happened kind of last time there was a ground invasion.
Yeah, perhaps, but I mean, internationalized. I mean, I don't know. We didn't see much out of the Biden statement. There's not really anything happening on the international front that can even slightly change Israeli behavior. There is, some of the statements from Congress and things like this, but it's congressional members, not all of Congress. But I don't know that the international front is going to change Israel's behavior. I think that there's going to be a lot more in internal pressure, if you know what I mean. Like they're going to have to contend with multiple fronts at this point. And even, by the way, like we haven't spoken about West Bank. Like the West Bank, there are escalations and violence in some of these camps. They're conducting arrest raids in major Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and so I don't know what that means, but the PA doesn't look very good right now. People are very angry. This is yet another nail in the coffin. I don't know how many nails they're going to be able to sustain. But yeah, I don't know if that was a good answer to your question. It's just a lot of moving parts.
Well, yeah, it is a lot of moving parts, but you helped me understand many of them. Thank you, Dana.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Dana el-Kurd. And as I mentioned at the outset, of course, this is a fast evolving situation, but I did appreciate her perspective on the context and background that led to this latest sad conflagration. All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.